He spent years walking through some of the most remote wilderness in North America, cameras rolling, searching for something most scientists refused to take seriously. And then, almost without warning, the show ended. The question nobody fully answered was what happened to James Bobo Fay after the cameras stopped. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what we found goes well beyond a television cancellation. To understand Bobo Fay, you have to understand the world he operated in, not just the cultural world of cryptozoology and cable television, but the physical world, the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, the Oregon Cascades, the dense timber belts of the Appalachian Corridor. These are not metaphorical wildernesses. These are places where the canopy closes so thick that satellite imagery struggles to resolve the ground beneath it, where ridge systems run for 40, 50, 60 miles without a paved road crossing them, where the annual rainfall in certain valleys exceeds 120 inches, where black bear populations are dense enough that the average hiker never sees one because the animals hear you coming long before you arrive. This matters because it is the specific context in which Bobo Fay built his entire adult identity, and it is the terrain that shaped his credibility among a community that spends its time in exactly these places. James Fay was born in 1963. He grew up in the Boston area, which might surprise people who associate him entirely with Northern California. His path to the Pacific Northwest was not a straight line. He attended the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he competed as a water polo player at a high level and developed the physical conditioning that would later define his fieldwork. He was large, strong, and genuinely comfortable with physical discomfort in the outdoors. These were not television affectations. People who knew him before finding Bigfoot have consistently described a man who was already living a fairly unconventional outdoor life before any production company came calling. He settled in Willow Creek, California. That location is specific and it matters. Willow Creek sits at the edge of the Trinity Alps and the Six Rivers National Forest. It calls itself the Bigfoot capital of the world, and it has done so for decades. The Patterson-Gimlin film, arguably the most analyzed piece of alleged Bigfoot evidence in the world, was shot in 1967 at Bluff Creek, which is approximately 38 miles northeast of Willow Creek. So Bobo Fay did not move to a random rural town. He moved to the center of gravity of American Bigfoot research and embedded himself there for years before Finding Bigfoot premiered in 2011. Finding Bigfoot ran on Animal Planet for 9 seasons. 9 seasons. That is a significant television run by any standard, not just for a show operating in a niche that many television executives would have dismissed after 1 or 2 seasons of low ratings. The show premiered on May 15, 2011, and it ran until May 22, 2016. Over those 5 years, the core team of Matt Moneymaker, Cliff Barackman, James Bobo Fay, and Renee Holland traveled to dozens of states, multiple countries, and logged hundreds of hours in the field across episodes that consistently drew somewhere between 1 and 2 million viewers per episode during its peak years. Bobo Fay's specific role on the show was well defined. He was the field guy, the one who would wade into the darkest corner of whatever forest they were investigating and stay there. He was the one who would lie down next to a cast footprint to provide scale for the camera, using his own 6'4" frame as the reference point. The show used this technique so consistently that it became almost a signature. A long, wide shot of a forest, a plaster cast in the dirt, and Bobo Fay stretched out beside it to demonstrate just how large the print was relative to a large adult male. It was effective television, and it was also, in its own way, a genuine investigative method. Scale matters in physical evidence analysis. The show ended without a dramatic finale. There was no on-air announcement of cancellation, no special retrospective episode, no reunion. It simply stopped. The final episode aired and that was it. For a show that had accumulated a dedicated audience across 9 seasons, the absence of a formal conclusion struck many viewers as abrupt. Animal Planet did not make extensive public statements about why the show ended when it did. Industry observers noted that the network was in the middle of a broader programming shift, moving away from the naturalistic and mystery-focused documentary style that had defined much of its output in the early 2010s. The cancellation was part of a wider pattern rather than a specific judgment about Finding Bigfoot's performance. But the more interesting question was always about the people. Specifically, what did Bobo Fay do when the structure of weekly television production was no longer organizing his life? The answer, at least initially, was that he did not dramatically change course. This is actually one of the most telling details. Many television personalities, when their show ends, pivot hard. They move into social media, they launch podcasts, they write books, they pursue speaking circuits. Bobo Fay did some of these things, but his pivot was much quieter and much more aligned with his pre-television identity. He went back to doing what he had been doing before the cameras arrived: field research, witness interviews, time in the woods. In the years immediately following the show's end, Fay continued attending and speaking at Bigfoot conferences. The Sasquatch Summit, held annually in the Pacific Northwest, was one venue where he remained a regular presence. He also remained connected to the broader BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, which is the group that Matt Moneymaker founded and which has served as the institutional backbone of the Finding Bigfoot team's work, both on and off camera. Fay's continued involvement with the BFRO after the show ended was not incidental. It reflected the fact that his commitment to the subject had never been primarily televisual. He gave interviews to regional outlets and to podcasts that cover the cryptozoology space. In these interviews, which accumulated in the years from 2016 through 2021, Fay was consistent on several key points. He maintained that he had encountered evidence that he found personally convincing. He was careful, usually, to distinguish between what he could state as fact and what remained inference. He acknowledged the frustration of 9 seasons of television without a definitive discovery. He did not pretend the show had ended with the answer it was looking for. He was also candid about the financial realities of life as a Bigfoot researcher outside of television. Willow Creek is a small town with a limited local economy. Before finding Bigfoot, Fay had supported himself through a variety of means, including commercial fishing in Alaska, which he returned to in the years after the show. Commercial fishing in Alaska is hard and specific work. It is seasonal, physically demanding, and lucrative enough on a per-season basis to support a modest life if you are willing to do it year after year. The image of a former television personality heading back to an Alaskan fishing boat is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something real about the gap between television celebrity and the economic realities of people who inhabit it. He also continued doing what he called public outreach, which in practice meant showing up at events where people wanted to talk about Bigfoot and actually talking with them in depth, without condescension. This was something people who attended these events consistently noted. Fay was not performative about it. He would sit with witnesses and listen to their accounts with the same attentiveness in 2018 that he had demonstrated in 2011 when a production budget was attached to every conversation. In 2019, Fay gave an extended interview to a regional outlet in Northern California in which he discussed what he described as a significant personal encounter from his years in the field, one that he said had not been fully captured or conveyed on television. He described a night in the Six Rivers National Forest, in a drainage he declined to specify precisely, in which he heard vocalizations that he said were unlike anything in his extensive experience of that forest. He had been in that forest for decades at that point. He knew the sound profile of that terrain. He was not describing excitement. He was describing something that he said had genuinely unsettled him. He did not claim to have seen anything. He was precise about that distinction. Sound, not sight. Evidence of presence, not visual confirmation. This is actually a meaningful distinction in the framework that serious Bigfoot researchers use. Auditory evidence is one category. Physical trace evidence, meaning footprints, hair samples, tree structures, is another. Visual sighting is the third and by far the most contested. Bobo Fay, throughout his career both on and off television, tended to be more restrained about visual sightings than his on-screen persona sometimes suggested. The show needed dramatic moments. The research itself was more methodical and less theatrical. By 2020, Fay had developed a more substantial social media presence, largely on Facebook, where he connected with witnesses and researchers. This was less about building an audience and more about maintaining a network. The Bigfoot research community is genuinely community-like in its structure. There are long-term relationships, running debates, shared databases of sighting reports, and a significant amount of interpersonal drama of the kind you find in any subculture organized around an unresolved question. Fay operated somewhere near the center of this network by virtue of his television visibility, but he was not trying to monetize that position aggressively. The pandemic years of 2020 and 2021 did something interesting to the Bigfoot research world more broadly, and Fay's trajectory reflected this. With outdoor recreation surging and people spending more time in forests and wild areas, the volume of reported sightings increased noticeably. The BFRO's database, which is one of the largest repositories of Bigfoot encounter reports in existence, received a higher volume of submissions during this period. Fay was one of the people involved in processing and investigating some of these reports, not as a television exercise, but as an ongoing research practice. He also became more vocal during this period about his views on the scientific establishment's treatment of the subject. This is a shift worth noting. In the Finding Bigfoot era, the show was careful to maintain a kind of respectful neutrality toward mainstream science, even while pursuing a hypothesis that most mainstream scientists dismissed. Fay post-television was somewhat less diplomatically neutral. In multiple interviews between 2020 and 2023, he argued that the dismissal of Sasquatch evidence by academic zoologists and anthropologists was not a neutral scientific judgment, but a social and professional one. That researchers who took the subject seriously faced genuine career consequences, and that this had distorted the academic record in ways that were not strictly about the evidence. He was not wrong that career pressure shapes research priorities. That is a documented phenomenon in institutional science. He was applying it to a specific case in which he had an obvious personal investment, which complicated the argument but did not necessarily invalidate it. He pointed specifically to the question of hair and tissue samples. Over the decades of formal Bigfoot research, samples have been submitted to genetic analysis on multiple occasions. The results have consistently either shown known species, most often bear or human, or degraded samples insufficient for typing. No sample has produced a novel primate profile. Fay's position on this, stated clearly in several contexts, was that the sampling methodology itself was flawed. That many of the samples analyzed came from collection procedures that were not rigorous enough to prevent contamination, and that the chain of custody from forest floor to laboratory was often inadequate. He cited specific cases where he believed collection had been done properly and results had been less definitive than the published summary suggested. This is a specific technical claim, and it is one that is genuinely difficult to evaluate from the outside, which may be part of the reason it circulates in the research community without resolution. His relationship with Cliff Barackman, his co-investigator from the show, remained visible and apparently warm. Barackman, who operates the North American Bigfoot Center in Boring, Oregon, has continued to be one of the more publicly active figures in the post-finding Bigfoot landscape. The two appeared together at events periodically, and Barackman spoke positively about Fay in public contexts on multiple occasions. The relationship between the two men was substantively different from the relationship between Fay and Matt Moneymaker, which was more professionally focused, or the relationship between Fay and Ronnie Holland, which was marked on screen by a genuine and recurring philosophical disagreement. Holland, a wildlife biologist, maintained a skeptical position throughout the show's run, and that disagreement was not performative. It was real. Post-show, Holland largely stepped back from the Bigfoot world, which is its own significant data point about what the experience of finding Bigfoot meant to different members of the team. Fay's public statements about Holland in the post-show period were consistently respectful. He acknowledged that her skepticism had served a legitimate function within the show's structure. He said, in a 2018 interview, that having someone on the team who pushed back forced everyone to be more rigorous about what they were claiming. Whether this represented his genuine view or a diplomatic framing of a difficult professional relationship is impossible to say from the outside. By 2022, Fay had begun appearing in other productions in a limited capacity, not as a lead, but as a contributor or subject. Several documentary series and streaming productions covering the broader cryptozoology space or the history of Bigfoot research featured him in interview segments. He was comfortable on camera, still physically imposing, still carrying the same unhurried confidence that had made him effective television a decade earlier. These appearances were not comeback attempts. They read more like a veteran subject matter expert doing what veterans do, providing context and continuity to productions made by people who weren't there in the early years. He was also candid in these later appearances about the psychological cost of years of inconclusive searching. This is something that rarely gets discussed in the context of reality television. The people who do this work, especially the ones who take it seriously, are accumulating experiences that don't resolve. Every expedition that doesn't find definitive proof is a trip into cognitive uncertainty. You hear something, you find something, you experience something that your senses tell you is significant, and then you come home with audio recordings that experts attribute to known species, or plaster casts that may or may not show dermal ridges, or nothing at all. Fay described this experience not with bitterness, but with something that sounded more like acceptance. He said in a 2021 podcast interview that the not knowing was something he had made his peace with over a long time, that the search itself had value regardless of where it ended. Now here is what most of the coverage of Bobo Fay missed, and this is the pivot that matters. The narrative around him after finding Bigfoot tended to frame his continued fieldwork as either admirable dedication or slightly sad persistence, depending on the bias of whoever was writing. Both framings missed something important. Fay's ongoing work was not primarily about proving anything to a skeptical public. It was about building and maintaining a specific kind of community archive. The witness interviews he continued conducting, the expedition reports he continued filing with the BFRO, the mentorship he provided to younger researchers entering the field, all of this represented a sustained and systematic effort to create a documented record of human experience in remote wilderness across decades. Whether or not that record ever yields a specimen that satisfies a peer-reviewed zoological standard, it constitutes something. It is a longitudinal account of what people have reported encountering in specific geographic areas across a span of time. Historians and anthropologists have occasionally noted that witness testimony databases, even about subjects that remain scientifically contested, have analytical value for understanding human perception, environmental psychology, and the relationship between rural communities and the wild spaces they live adjacent to. Fay was not making this argument himself, at least not in these terms, but it is the argument that makes sense of what he was actually doing with his time after the cameras stopped. He also became more involved in land access advocacy in a quieter way. The logging industry, road closures, and shifting federal management priorities in national forest lands have progressively restricted access to some of the most historically active areas for Bigfoot research over the years. Fay understood this as an issue not just for researchers, but for the broader category of people who use remote public lands: hikers, hunters, tribal members, naturalists of every kind. His advocacy here was informal rather than organized, but it was consistent with a lifelong orientation toward wild places as genuinely important and worth protecting. His health became a subject of some discussion in the community during the early 2020s. Years of commercial fishing, decades of fieldwork in wet, cold, steep terrain, and the general accumulation of physical miles on a large frame take a toll. Fay was not hiding this. He mentioned in several interviews that he had dealt with joint issues that were the predictable result of a life lived the way he had lived it. He was not dramatic about it. He was matter-of-fact in a way that suggested someone who had accepted the physical consequences of specific choices rather than someone who regretted those choices. The community response to these disclosures was notable. The Bigfoot research world is, in many ways, built on the credibility of its most prominent field investigators. When the person who spent decades in the woods tells you his body is showing the wear of that work, it reinforces the claim that the work was real. This is different from a television personality saying they worked hard. Fay's physical condition was documentation in a way that is specific to people who actually do difficult outdoor work over long periods. By 2023 and into 2024, Fay had developed what could reasonably be described as an elder statesman role within the Bigfoot research community. Not retired, not inactive, but occupying a different position than he had in the height of the television years. He was the person newer researchers sought out for context. He had direct field experience in locations that had been active for decades and that newer investigators were working to understand. He had witnessed the evolution of the technology used in field research, from plaster casting and audio recording to thermal imaging, environmental DNA sampling, and drone-assisted surveys. He had opinions about all of it, usually grounded and specific rather than abstract. He was also one of the people willing to say clearly that 9 seasons of Finding Bigfoot had not produced the evidence the show was looking for. This is a more honest position than the one that some participants in similar investigations adopt, which is to continuously reframe what has been found as more significant than it is in order to maintain the premise. Fay's willingness to acknowledge the limits of what the television work had achieved, without abandoning his underlying belief that the subject deserved investigation, was a position that required more intellectual honesty than the simpler alternatives in either direction. The simpler alternatives were, on one side, to declare that Finding Bigfoot had proven nothing and that Bobo Fay had wasted decades on a fantasy. On the other side, to double down on every piece of ambiguous evidence as confirmation. Fay consistently refused both of these framings. He held a position that is genuinely difficult to maintain, which is that the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, that the research continues to be worth doing, and that the absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence in a landscape as vast and as undersurveyed as the one he spent his life working in. That last point has independent scientific validity. The identification of new large mammal species in the 21st century has continued at a pace that surprises non-specialists. The saola, a large forest-dwelling bovine in Vietnam, was not known to science until 1992, and even then it took years of fieldwork to document properly. The Tapanuli orangutan, a distinct orangutan species, was not formally described until 2017. These were not small animals in remote oceanic islands. They were large mammals in regions that had been inhabited by humans for millennia. The argument that North America is too well surveyed for a large primate to remain undescribed is weaker than its mainstream acceptance might suggest, especially given how much of the most relevant terrain in the Pacific Northwest and the broader Mountain West is genuinely difficult to survey. Fay made this argument repeatedly, with specific reference to the topography of the areas where sightings were concentrated. He would describe the drainages, the elevation ranges, the seasonal movement patterns that witnesses reported, and layer them against what he knew about the terrain from years of direct experience. It was not the argument of someone looking for a comfortable belief. It was the argument of someone who had spent a significant fraction of his adult life in the specific places being discussed. What is still open, after all of this, is the question that has always been at the center of James Fay's life work. The evidence base for Bigfoot remains what it was: large, anecdotal, geographically distributed, and without a type specimen. No body, no bone fragment, no unambiguous genetic sample. The physical evidence that exists, the footprint casts, the recordings, the blurry photographs and videos, remains genuinely ambiguous. The most charitable interpretation does not close the case. The most skeptical interpretation does not eliminate all of the data points. What the end of Finding Bigfoot did eliminate was the possibility that a cable television production model was going to be the mechanism by which the question was resolved. That was never a realistic mechanism anyway. Field research designed primarily around broadcast schedules and dramatic payoffs is not the methodology that produces rigorous scientific findings. Fay understood this while he was doing it, and he has been clear about it afterward. What remains open is the possibility that the witness testimony database, the improved environmental DNA sampling technology, the increasingly accessible thermal and acoustic sensing equipment, and the continued work of people like Fay who have decades of site-specific knowledge might eventually produce something that forces a different kind of conversation. Not a television conversation, a scientific one. James Fay, as of the time this script was written in mid-2026, remained active in the research community, maintained his connection to the Northern California terrain that had been the center of his field work for decades, and had not abandoned the project that has defined his adult life. He had not found Bigfoot. He had also not stopped looking, and in the specific landscape he operates in, where the forest closes over and the ridgelines run for 50 miles without a road, and where the animal he is searching for has been reported by credible witnesses for over a century, the absence of a final answer is not, at least to him, the same thing as a final answer. That distinction is either the foundation of a life's work or the most expensive self-deception in the history of wildlife research. After everything, that question remains genuinely open.
James Bobo Fay gave 11 seasons of his life to finding Bigfoot, his health, his relationships, his financial stability, his entire identity. He walked into those forests as a man whose love for the wilderness was the most uncomplicated thing about him, and he came out the other side of 11 seasons as something more complicated and more damaged than the show ever showed. Now at 57, he is starting over. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what Finding Bigfoot took from Bobo Fay is the story Animal Planet never told. James Fay existed long before Finding Bigfoot turned him into Bobo, the lovable giant of the paranormal television landscape, whose combination of physical presence, infectious enthusiasm, and genuine woodsmanship gave the show its most immediately appealing cast member, and whose personality the production's entertainment framework reduced to a character whose depth the format was never equipped to fully represent. Before the cameras arrived, before the nickname became a brand, before the weekly deployments into remote wilderness corridors became the organizing structure of his professional existence, James Fay was a man whose relationship to the natural world had been built across decades of sustained, genuine engagement with the forests of the Pacific Northwest in a way that his television profile consistently undersold, and that the people who knew him before the show have described as the most essential thing about him. He was not a hobbyist. He was not an enthusiast whose weekend forays into the forest had accumulated enough encounters to give him a casual familiarity with Bigfoot evidence. He was someone whose physical presence in the deep forest, whose extended periods of sustained immersion in the specific environments where the evidence for Bigfoot's existence is most concentrated, had produced a relationship to the wilderness that goes beyond what most people in the modern world have the opportunity or the inclination to develop. The Pacific Northwest forest was not a location he visited. It was a place he belonged to in the specific and irreplaceable way that sustained presence in a landscape produces belonging. He read the forest the way people who grew up speaking a language read text, automatically, without conscious translation, with an immediacy of comprehension that people who learned the language later can approximate but never fully replicate. That quality, the quality of genuine belonging to the wild landscape the show was deploying him into, is what made Bobo indispensable to finding Bigfoot in a way that the entertainment format never fully articulated. And it is the quality whose loss, whose slow erosion across 11 seasons of treating the forest as a production location rather than a place of belonging, is the first chapter of the tragic story that the years since the show ended have continued writing in Bobo Fay's life. Finding Bigfoot asked things of its cast members that the broadcast format's entertainment presentation consistently softened into adventure rather than representing with the physical honesty that the full cost of what the show demanded would have required. The locations were remote in the actual sense, not the manufactured remoteness of production environments designed to look wild while remaining operationally accessible, but the genuine remoteness of wilderness terrain whose physical demands accumulate across a production schedule, whose pace and duration the show's audience never fully registered. Bobo Fay's physical engagement with those locations across 11 seasons was not the engagement of a television presenter moving through a dramatic backdrop. It was the engagement of a large man whose physical dimensions, the size and the mass that made him such an effective visual reference for track comparisons, were assets in terms of the show's investigative presentation and costs in terms of the physical demands that sustained movement through remote wilderness terrain imposes on a body carrying that size across that terrain, across that many years of production. The cumulative physical toll of 11 seasons of finding Bigfoot on Bobo's body is the chapter of his post-show story that the people closest to him have been most careful about in their public communications, because the specifics of what sustained physical demand across a decade of remote wilderness television production produces in a body are not the kind of details that a person whose public identity was built on physical capability and outdoor vitality finds straightforward to address publicly. What is known from the partial accounts available is that the years of production left physical marks whose persistence into the post-show period has shaped what Bobo's life looks like at 57 in ways that the life of a man who had not spent 11 seasons in those conditions would not have produced. Joints that absorbed a decade of movement through uneven terrain in extreme weather conditions. A body that was deployed into physical situations whose demands were calibrated to the production's dramatic requirements rather than to the sustainable physical management of a person who needed to still be functional when the cameras stopped rolling. The show was not cruel in its physical demands, but it was sustained, and sustained physical demand across 11 years of remote wilderness production at the pace Finding Bigfoot maintained accumulates in ways that a 57-year-old body carries differently than a 46-year-old body carried them when the show began. The paranormal television landscape has never been transparent about what it pays its cast members, and the specific financial arrangements that governed the Finding Bigfoot cast's compensation across the show's 11-season run are not part of the public record in any form that allows a precise accounting of what Bobo Fay earned from the production, whose commercial success made Animal Planet one of the most watched cable networks in its demographic during the show's peak years. What is part of the public record, in the form of the accounts of people familiar with the paranormal television industry's standard compensation structures, and in the form of what Bobo's post-show financial situation has communicated indirectly, is enough to establish that the financial rewards of 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot were substantially less transformative for the cast members than the show's commercial success and its audience scale might suggest to the outside observer. Reality television has a specific and well-documented history of generating substantial commercial value for the networks that broadcast it, while distributing that value to the cast members whose presence generates it in amounts that the network's profit margins do not proportionally reflect. The Finding Bigfoot cast were not stars in the compensation sense of performers whose market value gives them leverage in negotiating their share of the commercial value their work produces. They were cast members of a reality production whose compensation was structured in the framework that cable reality television applies to participants whose replaceability, in the production's assessment, limits the negotiating leverage their individual presence provides. Bobo Fay gave 11 seasons of his life to a production that generated substantial commercial value for Animal Planet. What he received in return, The financial compensation, whose accumulated total across 11 seasons represents the economic foundation on which the post-show life he is building at 57 must rest, is the chapter of the Finding Bigfoot story that the people most directly affected by it find most difficult to discuss without the specific combination of pride and pain that the gap between what the work produced commercially and what the workers received financially generates in the people who lived it. 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot operated on a production schedule whose demands on the cast members' time and presence were not compatible with the maintenance of the ordinary relationship structures that most people's lives are built around. The investigation deployments, the weeks spent in remote wilderness locations whose operational requirements removed the cast from their home environments for extended periods on a recurring schedule across the full production run, were not occasional disruptions to an otherwise stable domestic existence. They were the recurring structure around which any domestic existence had to be organized, and the organization that structure imposed on the relationships of the people living within it produced strains whose accumulated weight across 11 seasons the show's cheerful adventure presentation never acknowledged. Bobo Fay's personal relationships across the Finding Bigfoot years are the chapter of his story, whose specific details the privacy that he has always maintained about his personal life most effectively protects from public accounting. What the general shape of those years communicates, through the partial accounts of people who knew him during the production period, and through the specific character of what his life at 57 reveals about what the intervening years have and have not contained, is enough to establish that the relationship cost of 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot was real, was significant, and has shaped the starting over that his life at 57 requires in ways that the straightforward adventure narrative of the show's broadcast record does not prepare anyone to anticipate. The forest took his time, the production took his presence, and the gap between the time and presence that sustained relationships require and the time and presence that 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot left available is the gap whose consequences the post-show years have been living in. Starting over at 57 means starting over in every dimension of the word. The professional starting over is visible. The personal starting over is the one that costs more, and that the people who care about Bobo Fay have watched him navigate with the specific quality of resilience that his relationship to those forests has always communicated. The resilience of a man who knows how to keep moving through difficult terrain, because difficult terrain is where he has always done his best work. Finding Bigfoot ended. The production stopped. The schedule that had organized 11 years of Bobo Fay's life, the deployments, the investigations, the filming sessions, the post-production obligations, and the public appearances whose combined structure had given his professional existence its shape and its momentum across more than a decade, stopped. And what was left in the space that the production's cessation created is the chapter of his story whose specific character the show's audience was least prepared to understand because the show had never shown them the dimension of Bobo's relationship to the work that made its ending something more than a career transition. For most of the people who watched Finding Bigfoot, the show was entertainment. For Bobo Fay, it was the institutional vehicle for the most serious pursuit of his adult life, the systematic investigation of the Bigfoot question in the specific environment where the evidence for its answer was most concentrated. The show ending was not simply a television production concluding its run. It was the removal of the operational infrastructure, the resources, the access, the investigative platform that had given his field research its most sustained and most extensively documented form. The identity that 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot had built around him, Bobo, the beloved giant of paranormal television, the man whose enthusiasm and physical presence gave the show its most immediately engaging personality, did not survive the show's ending in the form the show had created it. What it left behind was James Fay, 57 years old, carrying the accumulated physical cost of 11 seasons of remote wilderness production, navigating the financial reality of what those seasons had and had not built, processing the personal cost of what the production schedule had done to the relationships that sustained ordinary life, and confronting the specific question that the ending of any identity-defining work produces in the people it defines. Who are you when the thing that made you is over? For a man whose love for the forest and whose commitment to the Bigfoot question had predated the show and would outlast it, the answer was available in principle. In practice, the years since the show ended have been the process of finding it, and the finding has not been without cost. The Bigfoot research community, the network of investigators, researchers, enthusiasts, and field workers whose collective engagement with the Bigfoot question had been one of the constants of Bobo Fay's adult life before, during, and after the Finding Bigfoot production, is the community that might have been expected to provide the professional and personal support structure that the show's ending removed from his life. The reality of what the community did and did not do for Bobo in the post-show years is more complicated than that expectation would predict, because the community's relationship to the Finding Bigfoot cast was itself complicated by the show's production in ways whose specific character the broadcast format's entertainment presentation had not prepared anyone to process honestly. The show had made the cast famous in a way that the Bigfoot research community's culture was not entirely equipped to integrate without friction. The tension between the serious field research that the BFRO methodology represented and the entertainment presentation that the Animal Planet format imposed on the investigation's documentation had produced resentments within the research community that the cast members had absorbed across 11 seasons of navigating the gap between what the investigation was and what the show presented it as. Those resentments did not simply dissolve when the show ended. They shaped the community's relationship to the cast members in the post-show period in ways that complicated the professional reintegration that the show's ending would ideally have permitted. For Bobo specifically, whose public profile was the most immediately recognizable of the cast members and whose personality had been shaped by the show into a character that the research community found both endearing and occasionally reductive. The post-show relationship to the community he had belonged to before the cameras arrived has been the specific professional dimension of the starting over that has required the most sustained navigation. He is returning to a community that changed in relationship to him across 11 seasons of television production, and that he changed in relationship to across the same period. The return is real. The warmth is real. But the navigation is also real. And at 57, with the physical costs and the financial realities and the personal losses of the production years in the background, the navigation of that return is one of the less straightforward elements of the starting over that his current life requires. There is a specific moment in Bobo Fay's post-Finding Bigfoot story that the people who have been closest to him in the years since the show ended identify as the point at which the trajectory of what the post-show years were going to look like became clear, not in the sense of a single catastrophic event whose impact can be precisely dated and precisely described, but in the sense of a moment whose character communicated something specific about what the accumulated weight of 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot had produced in a man who had carried that weight with the specific cheerfulness and resilience that his public persona had always displayed. The moment came in the period following the show's cancellation when the realization that the production infrastructure was not returning, that the deployments, the investigations, the institutional support that the production had provided for the field research was not a temporary hiatus, but a permanent conclusion settled into the daily reality of a life that had been organized around that infrastructure for 11 years. The people who were present with him in that period have described a quality in his engagement with the ordinary demands of daily life that the Bobo of the Finding Bigfoot years had never exhibited, a flatness whose character was not depression in any clinical sense, but something more specific and more poignant. The flatness of a man who had spent 11 years doing the thing he was most suited for in the world, in the environments where his particular combination of skills and knowledge and physical capability was most completely expressed, in the service of the question that had organized his deepest engagement with the natural world, and who found himself at 50-something doing something else. The forest was still there. The question was still there. The desire to be in that environment, pursuing that question, was as present in him as it had ever been. What was gone was the institutional vehicle that had given that desire its most sustained and its most extensively resourced expression. And the absence of the vehicle, the specific void left by the removal of the production infrastructure that had organized 11 years of his professional existence, is what the flatness of that period was communicating. He was not lost. He knew exactly where he was and exactly what he wanted to be doing. He just no longer had the means to do it in the form that had given his life its shape for more than a decade. Starting over at 57 is a different proposition than starting over at 37 or 47. The physical resources are different. The financial resources are different. The relationship infrastructure that most people's lives have built across the years that 57 represents is different. More established in some respects, more damaged in others, more complicated in all the ways that sustained professional dislocation and personal cost produce in the structures that ordinary life depends on. For Bobo Fay, starting over at 57 means starting over in the specific context of everything that 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot produced and took. The physical toll, the financial reality, the relationship cost, the identity crisis, and the community navigation that the post-show years have required him to work through without the production infrastructure that had previously organized the professional dimension of his engagement with all of it. What starting over looks like for him in practical terms is the combination of professional reinvention and personal reconstruction that the post-show years have been requiring. The identification of a professional context that can provide the relationship to the forest and to the Bigfoot question that the Finding Bigfoot production had formalized, and the rebuilding of the personal structures that the production schedule's demands had not always been compatible with maintaining. The professional reinvention has taken the form of the continuing engagement with the Bigfoot research community through channels that the television production's commercial framework had not encompassed. Field research conducted on the operational timeline of the research rather than the production schedule, evidence documentation whose methodology is governed by the investigative standard rather than the entertainment requirement, and the building of a relationship to the question that is entirely his own, rather than the production's version of his relationship to it. The personal reconstruction is the less visible and the more difficult dimension of the starting over. Rebuilding at 57, finding the relationships, the stability, the daily structure that the production years had complicated, is the work that happens away from cameras and away from the public attention that the Finding Bigfoot years produced. It is the work that the people who care about Bobo Fay watch him doing with the specific quality of attention that people bring to watching someone they love navigate something genuinely hard. Bobo Fay's story at 57 is not a story about failure. The word does not apply to a man who spent 11 seasons in the forests where the evidence for the most significant zoological question in North American natural history is most concentrated, who documented that evidence with the specific combination of practical fieldcraft and genuine physical commitment that no other Finding Bigfoot cast member could have provided, and who contributed to a body of field research whose complete record, including the investigation Animal Planet buried, contains findings whose significance the broadcast version of the show was never permitted to fully establish. His story is something more specific and more instructive than failure. It is the story of what chasing something real, genuinely, fully, at the cost of the ordinary life whose alternative was always available to him, produces in the person who does the chasing. The forest gave him what forests give people who commit to them completely. It gave him knowledge, experience, and encounters whose character his decades of accumulated fieldwork gave him the framework to understand in ways that most people who have ever tried to document what lives in those trees never will. What the show and the years and the physical and financial and personal cost of sustaining that commitment have also produced in him is the full accounting that the broadcast format's adventure presentation was never designed to provide. Starting over at 57 is not a tragedy in the sense of a story without resolution. It is a tragedy in the older sense, a story about a person whose genuine greatness and genuine commitment to something real produced consequences whose weight is proportional to the commitment rather than to any failure of character or judgment. Bobo Fay committed completely. He gave the forest and the question everything he had. What he received in return, the knowledge, the encounters, the complete investigation record that Animal Planet buried, and the specific understanding of the Bigfoot question that his accumulated fieldwork has produced in him, is real and significant and not nothing. But the cost of receiving it is also real. And at 57, carrying that cost in a body and a life that the 11 seasons shaped in ways whose full accounting the broadcast record never provided, he is starting over with the specific combination of loss and knowledge that only the people who commit completely to the things that matter most ever get to carry. The forest is still there. Bobo Fay is still going into it, and what he is looking for has not changed. What has changed is everything else. Finding Bigfoot ran for 11 seasons on Animal Planet and became one of the most watched wildlife-adjacent documentary series in cable television history without ever producing the single piece of evidence whose discovery its title promised. That contradiction, a show called Finding Bigfoot that across 122 broadcast episodes never found Bigfoot, has been the central tension of the franchise's public reception since its premiere in 2011, generating equal measures of devoted audience engagement and skeptical dismissal from critics who treated the show's consistent failure to produce definitive proof as evidence that the subject was not worth taking seriously. What that dismissal missed, what the show's most attentive viewers understood across its run without the institutional framework framework to fully articulate is that the contradiction was not accidental. Finding Bigfoot was not a show about finding Bigfoot. It was a show about the experience of looking for something whose existence the evidence strongly suggested, but whose definitive documentation remained perpetually one investigation beyond the show's reach. The team, Matt Moneymaker, Ronnie Holland, Cliff Barackman, and James Bobo Fay, were not performers playing investigators. They were genuinely experienced field researchers whose collective knowledge of the evidence base for Bigfoot's existence was more extensive than any comparable group the paranormal television format had assembled in a single production. Matt Moneymaker had founded the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization and spent decades systematically documenting encounter reports across the full geographic range of the phenomenon. Cliff Barackman's track-casting expertise and his methodical approach to physical evidence analysis represented a standard of forensic rigor that the broader Bigfoot research community had rarely achieved. Ronnie Holland's professional background as a field biologist gave the team a scientific skepticism that was genuine rather than performed, a willingness to apply conventional biological analysis to the evidence, and to say plainly when that analysis produced a conventional explanation. And Bobo Fay's physical presence in the field, his size, his woodsmanship, and his instinctive understanding of the terrain the investigations operated in, gave the team a capability in the deep forest that no studio-bound production could replicate. That team, operating across 11 seasons of field investigation in some of the most remote and most evidentially active wilderness in North America, produced 122 broadcast episodes, and then they filmed one more. That one is the episode that was just released. And the reason it was hidden while the others aired is the reason this video exists. The broadcast history of Finding Bigfoot is more evidentially significant than the show's critics have ever acknowledged, and more significant than the show's own format was designed to communicate. The episode structure, witness interviews, night investigations, wood-knocking sessions, call blasting, thermal camera deployments in active areas, was calibrated for television entertainment rather than scientific documentation, and the production decisions that shaped each episode prioritized dramatic presentation over evidentiary precision in ways that the team's most serious members were visibly uncomfortable with across multiple seasons. But underneath the entertainment format, the investigation record the broadcast seasons accumulated was genuinely substantive. The thermal hits logged across multiple investigation sessions in specific geographic areas, whose consistency indicated resident rather than transient activity. The acoustic responses to call blasting that the team documented at distances and with a speed that ruled out human production. The track evidence that Cliff Barackman documented at specific sites whose dermal ridge characteristics and anatomical proportions he analyzed on camera with the careful precision of a researcher whose professional credibility was on the line with every assessment he made. The tree structures and branch manipulations found at investigation sites in the Pacific Northwest, the Southeast, and the Great Lakes region whose construction characteristics Bobo assessed with the practical knowledge of a man whose physical dimensions gave him a uniquely calibrated sense of what human capability could and could not produce in the field. Ronnie Holland's role in the broadcast record is the most significant and the most underappreciated element of what the seasons built. She was never a true believer. Her scientific training and her professional skepticism were genuine, and they were applied consistently. She said no when the evidence did not meet her standard, and she said yes when it did. And the yeses she produced across 11 seasons carry a weight that no committed believer's affirmation could match. The specific investigations where Renee's skeptical framework produced genuine uncertainty rather than dismissal. The sessions where her on-camera response to the evidence was not the professional shake of the head that the audience came to recognize as her default, but something more unsettled and more specifically uncomfortable, are the investigations that map most directly onto the content of the band episode. She had been getting close to something across the final seasons. The band episode is where she arrived. The investigation that produced the band episode was conducted in a section of the Pacific Northwest, whose specific location the production team has not publicly identified in the communications that have accompanied the episode's release. What has been disclosed is the category of location, a remote old-growth forest drainage system in a geographic area that the Finding Bigfoot research team's prior fieldwork had identified as the single most evidentially dense location in their investigation history. The evidence density at this location was not the product of a single investigation season's findings. It was the accumulation of independent encounter reports physical evidence recoveries, and acoustic documentation from multiple independent sources across a period of years that preceded the Finding Bigfoot investigation by more than a decade. Matt Moneymaker's BFRO database contained a concentration of reports from this drainage system, whose geographic clustering and whose behavioral consistency across independent accounts separated by years of time indicated a resident population operating within a defined territorial range, rather than occasional individual transits through the area. Cliff Barackman had visited the location independently prior to the team's investigation deployment and had documented track evidence whose anatomical characteristics he assessed as among the most significant physical evidence he had encountered in his research career. The specific combination of factors that made the location significant: the old-growth forest canopy whose density provided the cover conditions that the behavioral evidence consistently associated with high-activity zones, the water sources that the encounter distribution was clustered around, the elevation and the aspect of the drainage whose combination produced the specific microclimate conditions that the prior physical evidence suggested were preferred, was as close to a guaranteed active zone as the team's collective field experience had identified in 11 seasons of investigation. When Animal Planet agreed to fund a full investigation deployment at this location, the team's internal communications reflected an awareness that this was different from the standard Finding Bigfoot episode deployment. Not different in its format. The witness interviews, the night investigations, the thermal deployments were all planned in the standard production framework, different in the quality of what everyone involved expected the investigation to produce. The location had been producing extraordinary evidence for years without a full systematic investigation. The team was the most experienced group of Bigfoot field researchers in the country. The conditions were optimal. Something was going to happen. What happened was not what anyone had prepared for. The Finding Bigfoot episode format always began with a town hall, a community meeting where local witnesses described their encounters, the team assessed the credibility of the accounts, and the investigation was oriented toward the areas and the behaviors the witness testimony indicated. The town hall for the banned episode investigation produced witness accounts that the production's standard format was designed to receive and that the team processed with the professional efficiency 11 seasons of practice had built into their collective methodology. What the town hall did not produce, what the production would not discover until the investigation was already underway, was the full picture of what the local community knew about this specific drainage system and what their relationship to it had been across the years of accumulated encounter activity that the BFRO database had only partially captured. The witnesses who attended the town hall told the team what they had seen. What they did not tell the team, what emerged only in the private conversations that Ronai Holland conducted with several community members after the formal town hall had concluded and the production cameras had been packed, was the extent to which the local population had developed a practiced relationship with whatever was operating in the drainage. Not a fearful relationship, not the unsettled, reluctant acknowledgement of something inexplicable that the town hall format typically produced. A relationship whose character Ronai described in her field notes from that evening as closer to the relationship an indigenous community maintains with a significant feature of its local landscape than to the reaction of a modern rural community to occasional anomalous wildlife encounters. The community knew the drainage, they knew its rhythms, they knew which times of year the activity was highest, which sections of the system produced the most consistent evidence, and which behavioral patterns indicated that whatever was operating there was settled and established rather than disturbed by human proximity. And several of them, the ones whose families had the longest connection to the area, knew something specific about the drainage that the BFRO database had not captured because none of them had ever submitted it to a formal reporting system. They knew that the drainage had a center, a specific location within it where the evidence was not distributed across a territorial range but concentrated, where the physical evidence, the acoustic activity, and the encounter frequency all pointed toward a single area as the focal point of whatever was operating in the system. That location is where Bobo insisted the investigation needed to go on the second night, and that is where the cameras were when the banned episode's footage was captured. The second night investigation at the focal point the community witnesses had identified produced the footage that the banned episode contains and that Animal Planet reviewed and removed from the broadcast pipeline before any episode was assembled. The thermal camera deployment at the focal point location was the most comprehensive the Finding Bigfoot production had mounted in any prior investigation. Multiple units covering overlapping fields of view whose combined coverage eliminated the single camera artifact explanations that could be applied to anomalous footage from isolated units. Cliff Barackman had positioned the cameras with the methodical spatial logic that his track analysis background had trained him to apply, covering the approach corridors that the physical evidence at the site indicated as primary movement routes, with overlapping coverage at the central area itself that would document whatever moved through it from multiple simultaneous angles. The call blasting session that preceded the thermal deployment had produced acoustic responses that Matt Moneymaker's field experience identified as coming from multiple independent sources at distances and from directions consistent with a population rather than a single individual, responses whose structure and whose spatial distribution across the drainage he documented in real time with the specific quality of controlled excitement that his 11 seasons of similar sessions had never quite produced before. The thermal cameras began logging anomalous signatures within the first 40 minutes of the night session. What distinguished the signatures from the range of thermal anomalies the team had documented across the prior seasons was not their size. Though the dimensions of the primary signature were at the upper boundary of the size range the team's investigation history had established, it was their number and their organization. 3 independent signatures visible simultaneously across the overlapping camera coverage, moving in a coordinated pattern whose spatial organization Bobo assessed in real time as consistent with the kind of deliberate positioning that his practical field experience had never previously encountered in any wildlife species he had knowledge of. They were not moving through the area. They were working it systematically, with a spatial awareness of each other's positions and a coordination of their individual movements that indicated a level of cooperative behavior whose cognitive requirements Ranai's biological framework found impossible to account for in any known North American species. Then the primary signature moved toward the camera position, not toward the team's position, toward the camera, as though it had identified the thermal unit as distinct from the investigators monitoring it and had decided to approach it specifically. What the camera documented when the primary signature closed to close range is the footage that produced the suppression decision. And it is footage that every person who has reviewed it has described with a consistency that communicates something specific about its character. Not frightening, not dramatic in the way paranormal footage is typically dramatic, but deeply and quietly final, like something that answers a question so completely that the act of watching it makes the prior uncertainty feel, in retrospect, like a form of protection that the footage permanently removes. The Finding Bigfoot investigation at the drainage focal point did not end because the production schedule was complete or because the team had achieved the documentation objectives the deployment was designed to pursue. It ended because of what happened in the 45 minutes following the primary thermal signature's approach to the camera position, a sequence of events that the cameras documented continuously and that the team experienced directly in a way that the prior 11 seasons of investigation had not produced in any of them. What occurred during those 45 minutes has been described by the team members in the limited private accounts that have circulated among people close to the production since the investigation was conducted. The descriptions are consistent across the independent accounts and consistent in the specific quality of what they communicate about the nature of the experience, not a dramatic confrontation, not a physical encounter in the sense of direct contact, but a sustained proximity event whose character the team's combined field experience was not adequate to process within the investigative framework they had been operating in for 11 seasons. Something was present at that location for 45 minutes in a way that everyone present understood as chosen, rather than incidental. It was there because it had decided to be there. It remained for the duration it chose to remain, and it departed with the same deliberateness with which it had arrived, not fleeing, not disturbed, but concluding something that it had apparently decided was worth concluding. Ronnie Holland's field notes from that night are the most significant document in the entire Finding Bigfoot investigation record. They have not been publicly released. What has been referenced in accounts of their content is that they contain Ranai's written assessment of the 45-minute sequence, an assessment produced in the field immediately following the event by a professional field biologist whose scientific framework was applied to every prior Finding Bigfoot investigation with consistent rigor, and that the assessment does not contain the language of uncertainty or ambiguity that Ranai's prior field documentation consistently produced when the evidence she was encountering fell short of her evidentiary standard. The notes are written in the language of conclusion. The investigation ended the following morning. The equipment was packed without the standard post-investigation documentation session. The team left the drainage without the debrief that 11 seasons of operational practice had established as standard procedure. And nobody talked about what had happened. Not to the production, not to Animal Planet, not to the research community, and not publicly, until the banned episode's release made the silence unsustainable. The footage from the Finding Bigfoot banned episode investigation was reviewed by Animal Planet within the standard post-production timeline following the session's conclusion. What distinguished the subsequent process from every prior episode's post-production workflow was the specific point in the review chain at which the footage's escalation to the network's executive level occurred, and the specific nature of the response that escalation produced. The production editor who conducted the initial raw footage review had worked on the Finding Bigfoot production across multiple seasons. They had reviewed footage from every category of anomalous evidence the show had produced: the thermal hits, the acoustic responses, the physical evidence documentation, and the night investigation sessions whose most dramatic moments had been shaped into broadcast entertainment across 11 seasons of episodes. What they encountered in the raw footage from the drainage investigation was something they had not previously encountered in any prior season's material, and their response to it was not to flag it for the standard editorial process that shaped anomalous footage into broadcast content. It was to stop the review and escalate immediately. Animal Planet's response to the escalation followed a pattern whose specific characteristics are inconsistent with a network making a purely internal editorial decision about difficult content. The decision was made at an organizational level above the standard production executive chain. It was made within a time frame that the normal deliberative processes of an organization that size do not permit for content decisions requiring careful evaluation, and it was communicated back to the production not as an editorial judgment about specific footage, but as an instruction, comprehensive, non-negotiable, and accompanied by the specific additional instruction that the investigation had not taken place and that no reference to it was to appear in any subsequent production communication. That instruction is the most revealing element of Animal Planet's response. Networks that pull episodes for ordinary editorial reasons acknowledge the episode's existence while declining to broadcast them. The instruction to treat the investigation as non-existent was not an editorial decision. It was a suppression decision. And the specificity of it, the totality of the erasure it demanded, applied to footage from a show whose prior 122 episodes had never produced a comparable response, communicates something about the character of what the drainage footage contained that is as significant as any description of the footage itself. Finding Bigfoot spent 11 seasons looking. The banned episode is what the looking found. Animal Planet did not suppress this footage because it contained more ambiguous evidence. They suppressed it because the thermal cameras documented something at close range for 45 minutes that chose to be there, stayed for the duration it chose to stay, and departed when it was finished. That is not ambiguous evidence. That is confirmation. The broadcast record of 122 episodes was the search. The banned episode is the arrival. Ronai Holland's field notes from that night are written in the language of scientific conclusion rather than investigative hypothesis. That is the most significant sentence in this entire video. The most demanding scientific skeptic on the most watched Bigfoot investigation show in television history wrote in the language of conclusion. The footage that produced those notes has been in a production archive for years. It is now in the world. What it shows has been in those forests the entire time. The search is over. What comes next is something else entirely. Bobo Fay has spent more nights in the deep forest looking for Bigfoot than almost anyone alive. He is not a researcher or a scientist or a television presenter. He is a woodsman whose physical size, whose fieldcraft, and whose instinctive understanding of the terrain he works in gave Finding Bigfoot a capability in the deep wilderness that no studio production could manufacture. He has never discussed this investigation until 1 minute ago. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what Bobo just revealed is the one thing Finding Bigfoot was never supposed to say out loud. James Fay, Bobo to everyone who has ever spent 5 minutes in the Finding Bigfoot orbit, occupies a specific and irreplaceable position in the Bigfoot research community that his television profile has always undersold. The show's format positioned him as the comic relief, the large, enthusiastic, perpetually optimistic woodsman whose sheer physical presence in the forest made him useful as a size reference for track comparisons, and whose willingness to wade into any dark terrain, climb any ridge, or spend any number of hours in any weather condition doing call blasting made him invaluable as an operational asset in the field. That positioning was accurate as far as it went. What it did not capture, what the 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot's broadcast record only occasionally surfaced in ways that the audience could fully register, was the depth of the fieldcraft and the accumulated experiential knowledge that Bobo brought to every investigation the show conducted. He did not come to Finding Bigfoot as a television personality who happened to be interested in Bigfoot. He came as a man whose relationship to the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the broader North American wilderness had been built across decades of sustained presence in exactly the environments where the evidence for Bigfoot's existence is most concentrated. He understood those environments in the specific, practical, embodied way that only extended time in them produces. He read the terrain, the weather, the wildlife behavior, and the physical evidence of large animal presence with the instinctive accuracy of someone whose survival in those environments had depended on that reading. That understanding gave Bobo's assessments of the physical evidence the team encountered a credibility that the show's format did not always give him the space to fully articulate. When Bobo said something was significant, it was because his accumulated experience in comparable terrain had given him a reference framework for what significant looked like and what it did not look like, a distinction that the show's most serious viewers came to rely on his judgment to draw. When he said something was unlike anything he had encountered before, it carried the weight of a man who had encountered a great deal and who understood the difference between the extraordinary and the genuinely anomalous. The investigation he just revealed falls into the second category, not because what the team encountered was more dramatic than the prior season's most intense investigation mode, because it was more final. And Bobo is the person whose decades of fieldwork gave him the framework to understand what that finality meant in terms of what it confirmed about the question the show had been asking across its entire run. The investigation, whose details Bobo just revealed, was not generated by the Finding Bigfoot Productions standard location selection process. It did not emerge from the research team's review of BFRO report databases or from a witness contact who reached out to the show through its official channels. It came from Bobo's own knowledge of the terrain, from years of personal fieldwork in a specific section of the Pacific Northwest that he had been returning to independently of the show's production schedule, because the evidence he kept finding there across those independent visits had been building a picture that the show's investigation deployments had not yet been designed to fully address. Bobo's relationship to this location predated Finding Bigfoot by years. He had first visited the area during an independent research trip that the BFRO had organized in the period before the television production began, and what he had found on that first visit, the track density, the structural evidence, the acoustic activity during a single overnight stay, had produced in him the specific quality of recognition that his years of fieldwork had trained him to distinguish from the ordinary strangeness that the deep forest produces for people who spend enough time in it. This was not ordinary strangeness. The location had been actively producing evidence of a consistent and specific character across every visit Bobo had made to it in the years between that first trip and the investigation whose details he is now revealing. The track evidence at the location showed a distribution pattern consistent with territorial use rather than transient passage, impressions in the soft ground of the creek systems and the forest floor, whose concentration in specific areas of the location indicated regular, repeated use of defined corridors rather than the random distribution that passing wildlife produces. The structural evidence, the tree manipulations, the branch constructions, the specific arrangements of natural materials that Bobo's fieldwork had given him the reference framework to assess, showed a sophistication and a consistency across the location's most active areas that his accumulated experience placed in a category distinct from anything the surrounding wildlife was capable of producing. And the acoustic environment of the location, the specific quality of the sounds the night produced when Bobo had spent overnights there on his independent visits, was something he has described in the limited prior references he has made to the location as the detail that kept bringing him back. The forest at this location sounded different, not frightening, not unusual in the ambient sense of a new environment producing unfamiliar sounds, different in the specific way that a place sounds when something in it is listening. Bobo's account of what he communicated to the Finding Bigfoot team in the period before the investigation was deployed at the location is one of the most significant elements of his reveal, because it establishes the specific expectations the team brought to the investigation and the relationship between those expectations and what the investigation actually produced. He did not build the team's anticipation by describing the location in dramatic terms. Bobo's communication style in the field is practical rather than theatrical. He describes what he has seen and what he has found and what his assessment of those things is, without the performative enthusiasm that the show's broadcast format sometimes wrapped around his contributions. What he communicated to Matt Moneymaker and the rest of the team in the pre-investigation briefing was exactly that, a practical, specific account of what his prior visits to the location had produced and what his assessment of that evidence suggested about the nature of the presence at the location. He told them the location was occupied, not visited, not transited, not the temporary range of a single individual. occupied in the sense that his understanding of the territorial behavior patterns the prior evidence indicated suggested a resident population whose use of the location was consistent, established, and organized around the specific terrain features that his visits had identified as the focal points of the area's anomalous activity. He told them the physical evidence at those focal points was of a quality he had not encountered at any other location in his years of field research. The combination of track evidence, structural evidence, and biological material whose collection he had been careful not to disturb on his prior visits in the expectation that the right investigation deployment would eventually be organized around the location. He told Cliff Barackman specifically that the track evidence at the creek drainage focal points was going to be the most significant physical documentation opportunity either of them had encountered in their research careers. Cliff's response to that assessment, from a man whose track analysis expertise gave him the specific context to evaluate the claim, was to treat the investigation deployment as the most important the show had yet organized, and he told Renai that the location was going to challenge her framework in a way that none of the prior investigations had challenged it, not because he expected her to abandon her skepticism, he respected her skepticism and always had, but because what the location had been producing across his prior visits was evidence that her methodological framework was going to have to work very hard to account for conventionally. It did not account for it conventionally. What it produced instead is what Bobo's reveal addresses in full. The Finding Bigfoot team arrived at the location in the late afternoon and spent the initial hours of the investigation establishing the baseline documentation that the show's methodology required before any active investigation session could be conducted. Bobo guided the baseline survey with the specific knowledge of the location's geography that his prior visits had given him, directing the team to the creek drainage focal points where the prior physical evidence had been most concentrated, positioning the monitoring equipment at the approach corridors whose activity levels his previous overnight stays had established as highest, and identifying the specific areas of the location where the structural evidence from his prior visits remained visible as contextual documentation for what the baseline survey was establishing. What the team found during the baseline survey exceeded what Bobo's prior account had led them to anticipate, not in its general character, which was consistent with his description, but in its freshness. The physical evidence at the focal points was recent. The track impressions in the creek drainage soil whose condition Cliff Barackman assessed with the forensic precision his track analysis career had developed indicated activity within the prior 24 to 48 hours. The structural evidence at the primary focal point, the branch constructions and tree manipulations that Bobo had documented on his prior visits, had been added to and reorganized since his most recent independent visit, indicating ongoing use of the site in the period between visits. And the biological material visible at the primary nest structure was fresh enough that Ranai's field biology assessment placed its deposition within a day of the team's arrival. The location had been actively used within the prior 24 hours. Whatever was using it had been there the day before the team arrived and was not far away now. The baseline survey was still in progress when the first acoustic event occurred. Not a distant vocalization heard at the edge of audible range, a close, structured, directional sound that the team's audio equipment captured with a clarity that the prior season's acoustic documentation had not produced, and that Bobo identified immediately from his prior overnight experiences at the location as the specific sound the forest made when whatever lived there was acknowledging the presence of something new in its territory. The forest was not alarmed. It was paying attention, and it had been paying attention since before the team completed their first hour on the ground. The first night of the investigation produced evidence that Cliff Barackman subsequently described as the most evidentially significant single night's documentation in the Finding Bigfoot production's history. Track evidence documented at 4 separate locations within the investigation area during the active investigation session. Acoustic responses to call blasting that Matt Moneymaker assessed as coming from multiple independent sources at distances and from directions consistent with a coordinated response rather than individual territorial reaction, and thermal signatures at the tree line of the primary focal point that the cameras tracked for extended periods without resolving into any wildlife species whose behavior pattern matched what the monitoring documented. The second night was when the investigation moved from extraordinary into the territory, whose details Bobo has been carrying since the investigation concluded. The camp had been positioned at the edge of the primary focal point area, a deliberate decision whose logic was to put the investigation team in close proximity to the location's most active zone overnight rather than at the distance that standard safety protocols might have suggested. Bobo's prior overnight experience at the location had informed that decision. He knew the active zone's nighttime character from his independent visits, and his assessment was that proximity rather than distance was the approach that would produce the most significant documentation. What he had not anticipated, what his prior overnight experience at the location had not produced, and therefore had not given him the experiential basis to predict, was the specific development that the second night generated at the camp position. Something approached the camp, not at the tree line, not at the outer boundary of the thermal camera's coverage range, not at the ambiguous middle distance that the prior season's most dramatic night investigation moments had typically occupied. Something approached to within a distance that Bobo's account characterizes with the specific precision of a man who has spent enough nights in the deep forest to calibrate proximity accurately. Close enough that the distinction between an organism choosing to approach and an organism that had decided the camp's position within its territory required direct assessment was not a distinction that needed to be drawn theoretically. Close enough that the sound of its movement through the undergrowth at the camp's edge was audible without equipment, and close enough that what the thermal cameras documented when their coverage captured it at that proximity is what the rest of Bobo's reveal addresses, and what Animal Planet's editorial process determined the audience could not be shown. The thermal camera coverage of the camp perimeter during the period of the approach documented something that the Finding Bigfoot Productions' prior 11 seasons of investigation had not produced at comparable proximity. A thermal signature whose characteristics, documented at a range that the camera's resolution was fully adequate to capture in detail rather than in the ambiguous outline that distance typically produces in the show's thermal footage, established the following with the specificity that close-range thermal imaging permits. The signature was bipedal, not the intermittent bipedalism of a bear investigating a scent or responding to a disturbance. The sustained, habitual, mechanically efficient bipedalism of a species for whom walking on two legs is the primary and natural mode of locomotion. The gait pattern visible in the thermal footage across the frames that captured the approach to the camp perimeter was analyzed by Bobo in real time with the practical biomechanical reference framework his years of close observation of large primate locomotion in field conditions had built, and his real-time assessment was that what the camera was showing him was bipedal locomotion of a quality and a fluency that no known North American species other than a human being produces. It was not a human being. The thermal signature's dimensions, the shoulder width, the overall body mass as indicated by the heat signature's size, the limb proportions visible in the camera's resolution at that range, placed it outside the human size range in a manner whose clarity the proximity of the documentation did not permit to be ambiguous. Bobo's account of reviewing the thermal footage in real time on the monitoring screen during the approach is the element of his reveal that communicates most directly what the experience of that night produced in a man whose decades of fieldwork had given him the most extensive experiential reference framework in the team for assessing exactly this category of evidence. He has described the moment of seeing the signature clearly on the monitor, seeing its dimensions, its bipedalism, its proximity, with a consistency across the different accounts of his reveal that communicates something specific about what that moment produced in him. Not excitement, not the performance of excited discovery that the show's broadcast format had cultivated across 11 seasons. Something quieter, the quality of a man who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just seen it in a form that his entire prior search had not produced. Close, clear, and unambiguous in a way that the preceding years of ambiguous evidence had not been. What the cameras documented at the camp perimeter that night is what Animal Planet reviewed and what Animal Planet buried, and what it shows is what Bobo just described for the first time outside the production's internal record. The Finding Bigfoot team's response to what the thermal cameras were documenting at the camp perimeter during the approach is captured in the investigation's recording infrastructure and described by Bobo in his reveal with the plainness that his communication style has always applied to significant field events, not dramatized, not amplified, just described in the specific terms that make clear what happened and what each team member's response to it was. The team was together at the monitoring position when the approach occurred. They were not distributed across the investigation area in the deployment configuration that the active investigation sessions used. They had returned to the camp position for a scheduled equipment check and were reviewing the monitoring feeds together when the signature appeared in the perimeter camera coverage. All four of them saw it simultaneously. Bobo's account of what each team member's response was in the moment the signature resolved on the monitor is one of the most humanly significant elements of his reveal, because the specific quality of each response communicates something about what the signature's close-range clarity produced in people with different relationships to the evidence that Bigfoot research produces. Matt Moneymaker went quiet in a way that Bobo describes as unlike his typical response to significant evidence, not the organized, analytically engaged quiet of a researcher processing a finding, but the specific silence of a man whose entire professional life has been organized around the pursuit of exactly what the monitor was showing him, confronting it at last in a form that his professional framework was not fully adequate to process. Cliff Barackman picked up his documentation equipment and began recording the monitor feed with a methodical precision that Bobo describes as the most focused he had ever seen Cliff operate in a field situation. Not excited, not hesitant, just completely absorbed in the documentation task in a way that reflected his understanding that what was on the monitor was what his forensic research career had been building toward. Ronnie Holland said one word. Bobo does not reproduce the word in his reveal. He describes it only as the word that a scientist who has spent 11 seasons applying rigorous skepticism to the evidence for Bigfoot's existence says when the evidence in front of her exceeds the explanatory reach of the skeptical framework she has been applying. The word communicated that her framework had reached its limit. Whatever she said in that moment is in the production's audio record. Whether it will ever be in the broadcast record is the question that Animal Planet's editorial decision about the investigation's footage has kept unanswered. Animal Planet's decision to pull the footage from the investigation Bobo is describing was communicated to the Finding Bigfoot production within a time frame that he characterizes in his reveal as faster than any prior editorial decision in the show's 14-season broadcast history. Not deliberated, not subjected to the extended review process that content decisions of comparable significance typically require in the operational rhythm of a cable television network. Made quickly, communicated clearly, and implemented with a totality that reflected institutional certainty rather than editorial consideration. Bobo's account of how the decision was communicated to the team is one of the most revealing elements of the entire disclosure, because the manner of the communication told the team as much about the nature of the decision as the decision itself. It did not come with an editorial justification. Networks that pull content for ordinary content management reasons provide explanations. The evidence is too ambiguous for the show's evidentiary standard. The footage raises legal concerns about the location's owner. The content exceeds the network's programming parameters for its audience. The communication about the investigation footage provided none of those conventional justifications. It provided an instruction. The footage was not to be broadcast. The investigation was not to be referenced. The production was to proceed with its schedule as though the investigation had not occurred. Bobo's response to that instruction, and to the decision it represented, is something he describes in his reveal with a candor whose quality reflects the specific position he has always occupied in the Finding Bigfoot operation as the team member whose practical field orientation made him the least embedded in the institutional frameworks that complicate the other team members' responses to the editorial relationship with the network. He did not accept the justification because no justification was offered. He did not accept the decision as an ordinary editorial call because the speed and the totality of it was not consistent with ordinary editorial process. What he accepted, what the years since the investigation have produced in him in terms of his understanding of what the decision represented and why it was made, is a conclusion about the institutional calculation that Animal Planet performed when its review of the investigation footage produced the suppression decision. The network understood what the footage showed. It understood what showing it would mean for the audience's relationship to the question the show had been asking across 11 seasons, and it made the calculation that what showing it would mean was something it was not willing to produce. Bobo accepted that calculation long enough to stay silent about the investigation. He has now decided the silence has lasted long enough. James Fay has spent more time in the forests where Bigfoot is reported to exist than almost any other living person. The investigation he just revealed is where that time finally arrived at its destination. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a blurry image at distance, thermal footage at close range on a specific night at a specific location that his decades of fieldwork gave him everything he needed to understand. He does not frame what he saw as a belief. He frames it as something he saw on a monitor, close enough to be clear, documented well enough to be unambiguous, and buried by the network before the audience could see it, because the audience seeing it would have made the question Finding Bigfoot had been asking for 11 seasons impossible to keep asking. 11 seasons of thermal signatures and acoustic responses and track evidence were the approach. The investigation nobody was allowed to see was the arrival. Animal Planet made sure the audience never got there. Bobo just took them there anyway, in the plainest terms he knows, the way he has always done everything in those forests, without performance, without doubt, and without any more silence about what he saw.
For years, viewers of Finding Bigfoot saw Ronai Holland as the skeptical voice of reason, the scientist who challenged eyewitness claims, demanded hard evidence, and refused to let emotion steer the investigation. But ever since the show disappeared without answers, she stayed quiet until now. After months of silence, Ronai finally steps forward with new information about events behind the camera, unexplained encounters that never made it to air, and a discovery that may force her to rethink her entire career. Subscribe for more cryptid investigations just like this, because once you hear what she's been holding back, you'll never look at Finding Bigfoot the same way again. Ronai Holland's childhood in the Pacific Northwest wasn't defined by Bigfoot obsession like many assume. If anything, it was defined by silence, the quiet, uneasy stillness of the deep Washington woods. Her father worked as a respected fishing guide, the type of man locals trusted more than any forest ranger. He knew every creek bend, every animal sign, every ridge where elk huddled in winter. On slow summer evenings, he would point out unusual things to a young Ronai: gouges in cedar bark 8 feet high, or heavy tracks in deadfall that didn't match cougar or bear. "It's the woods talking," he would say, brushing the hair from her eyes. Back then, she believed him. She was just a kid. Everything changed at 16 when her father passed suddenly from an unexpected cardiac event. The loss fractured her family's relationship with the land. Hunting trips stopped. Silence returned. But it felt colder now, crueler. To cope, Ronai escaped into textbooks. She immersed herself in biology, ecology, and primate anatomy. She built her identity on measurable data, not folklore. By the time she entered graduate school, she carried a chip on her shoulder the size of an old-growth stump. Believing in anything without proof felt reckless, even childish. Classmates noticed she never joked about cryptids like others. Professors found her meticulous, almost aggressive in her insistence that science shouldn't bend to comfort. She published early research on primate stride mechanics and vocalization patterns, gaining praise for her skepticism. When whispers of her father's old journals resurfaced, notebooks filled with strange vocal recordings and footprint sketches, she refused to read them. She boxed them away, literally, in her mother's attic. Science was her armor now. Students who worked with her said she didn't hate Bigfoot believers. She hated the distraction the myth caused. She saw it as a parasite draining resources from real conservation efforts, which is why, years later, when producers from Finding Bigfoot approached her, she only agreed to be the skeptic. She wasn't just counterbalance for TV. She was defending the version of herself she'd built to survive. Deep down, the woods still whispered, but Ronai wasn't going to listen. Not yet. After graduate school, Ranai's work shifted toward salmon ecology along the Oregon and Washington River systems, a position that required long stretches of time in the field. She studied predator-prey relationships, monitored spawning behavior, and logged changes in forest canopy density, standard assignments for a rising biologist. But almost immediately, she began noticing patterns that didn't fit the textbooks. Elk herds that historically migrated south in October suddenly reversed course mid-season. Black bear populations abandoned territories that offered abundant food, instead taking routes that forced them into human settlements. She logged these anomalies carefully, expecting confirmation from other researchers, but the responses came back quiet and uneasy. During a survey near the Clackamas River Basin, her field microphone recorded a low, resonant call at 2:14 a.m. The sound wasn't canine, too deep. It wasn't cougar, too slow in cadence. Its pitch modulation suggested a large chest cavity, but the waveform was oddly flat, lacking the harmonic signature of known mammals. When she brought the recording into the lab, the spectrogram software produced a tag she'd never seen before: unknown mammalia. No match. Her supervisor told her to archive it and focus on verifiable data. The instruction wasn't dismissive, it was nervous. Over the next 9 months, more oddities appeared. River otters, abandoned dens with fresh fish caches untouched. Ravens circled vacant forest clearings without visible carrion. A cluster of Douglas firs were stripped of bark nearly 12 feet up, far above deer scrape height. Local hunters she interviewed described hearing something that talked back and forth across valleys, deep and rhythmic, almost patterned. One man refused to let her quote him, whispering, "Some things don't want to be found." That's when she learned a quiet truth no academic dared voice publicly. Several field biologists across Washington had been meeting informally for years, comparing unclassified recordings. Most refused to publish. The consensus wasn't that the data was wrong, it was that acknowledging it would drag their careers into ridicule. At home, Ranai found herself dreaming of forests shifting like ocean tides. She'd wake to her phone buzzing, colleagues forwarding fresh anomalies, each prefaced with the same words, "Do not attach my name." Science had always been her shield against the unknown. Now it seemed like a wall that someone, or something, was gently tapping on from the other side. When producers from Finding Bigfoot first reached out in 2010, Ranai assumed it was a mistake. She'd spent her adult life distancing herself from her father's cryptid curiosities, and the idea of joining a television show about them felt like betrayal. But the producers weren't looking for a believer. They wanted contrast, a trained biologist who could scrutinize claims, analyze evidence, and ground the show in rational thought. They needed someone who, on camera, wouldn't hesitate to say, "No, this doesn't add up." And Ranai fit the mold perfectly. She negotiated only one condition. She would never be scripted to pretend belief. Authentic skepticism was non-negotiable. The network agreed publicly that honesty made the show credible. Privately, executives saw an even more valuable dynamic: tension. Skeptic versus believer drives viewership. But what viewers never saw was the briefing binder Ranai received before filming. Inside were dozens of witness statements never aired, most from individuals who refused to be filmed: wilderness firefighters, tribal wildlife technicians, and 2 retired forest law enforcement officers. They all described eerily consistent details: broad shoulders, forward-leaning posture, mid-foot flexibility uncommon in humans, and eye shine resembling deep amber. These weren't campfire storytellers, they were professionals, trained to observe. Production nights became controlled chaos. Ranai stood behind camera crews listening to vocalizations echoing through the tree line. Whoops, knocks, and deep chest-shaking roars no animal textbook could account for. As the skeptic, she knew the audience expected her to provide rational explanations, and she tried. But privately, she began cataloging similarities, frequency ranges, call intervals, suspected territorial spacing. Off-camera, she reviewed evidence with her co-hosts. She'd point out stride patterns or hair samples under ultraviolet examination. Sometimes she found an explanation: bear drag marks, elk alarm calls. But other times, her scientific toolbox came up empty. By the end of the first season, producers noticed something subtle in her field notes. She'd stopped writing "unknown," likely misidentified animal. Instead, the notes read "unknown," consistent with prior reports. Her skepticism wasn't weakening, it was evolving, and when she realized how much the network chose not to air, she began to wonder whether she was being included to debunk the unknown or to make not acknowledging it more palatable to the public. Halfway through filming the Montana episode, the crew set up on the edge of dense timber, where local hunters reported something pacing tree lines at night. It was routine: thermal cameras scanning, parabolic mics recording ambient sound, cast members whispering into radios. Then, just after 1 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. Ranai noticed the breath from camera operators suddenly fogging. Before she could comment, the thermal operator stiffened. On his monitor, a figure appeared, upright, broad-shouldered, and moving with deliberate, measured steps. Bear's lumber, elk bolt. This paced. It kept exactly 50 yards away, matching the team's lateral movement as if testing boundaries. The thermal signature glowed bright white, but there was no visible light source. Ranai listened carefully. The cadence of the footfalls was heavy, but not clumsy. 4 steps. Pause. 4 steps. Something intelligent enough to conceal noise. Suddenly, the radios crackled with static, the kind that swallows voices. Parabolic microphones fuzzed. Ranai raised a hand to signal movement toward the tree line, but a producer intercepted her, whispering sharply, "Back to vehicles." Now it wasn't fear in his voice, it was protocol. Back at the lodge, Ranai reviewed the thermal footage frame by frame. The leg extension was beyond human stride. Muscle mass bulged visibly through the heat signature. She noted mid-foot flexation, rare in hoax suits. The next morning, she was told legal needed to verify chain of custody on the clip. 2 weeks later, she learned the footage was pulled entirely for insufficient clarity. When the episode aired, viewers saw none of it. The pacing figure never existed, at least not on television. That night was the first time Ranai wondered if the network's silence wasn't about credibility, but containment. As Ranai's exposure on Finding Bigfoot grew, so did the number of scientists quietly contacting her. Field ecologists, forestry analysts, acoustic specialists, people trained to document anomalies without sensationalism. They shared private folders containing spectrograms, hair fibers with undocumented medulla patterns, and audio files exhibiting harmonic structures too complex for known North American mammals. These researchers didn't want credit. They wanted someone with a public platform to confirm they weren't imagining things. At first, Ranai assumed the silence from academia was just professional caution. But then, something stranger happened. People stopped responding. An ecologist from British Columbia, who had spent 5 years mapping vocalization clusters, suddenly canceled their correspondence. His university page disappeared, and his public email bounced back as undeliverable. Months later, Ranai heard through a colleague that he'd signed a non-disclosure agreement related to undocumented fauna. Another contact, a wildlife technician from Idaho, had been tracking large bipedal prints across riverbeds, prints with dermal ridges too crisp to be fabricated. She'd planned to publish a paper comparing them to primate foot structure. Before submission, her grant was revoked. She left her position entirely. When Ranai attempted to reach her, a family member answered and simply said, "She can't talk about that anymore." One of the most concerning cases involved a federal forestry analyst who had documented activity in the Cascades. He had classified dozens of sound signatures as Category U, uncertain vocalization. After multiple unexplained reassignments, he stopped attending community forums. His remaining research was archived under restricted access. A mutual friend later confided that he'd been pressured into signing paperwork to protect ecosystem-level confidentiality. The phrasing was so vague it bordered on meaningless, yet it carried legal teeth. When Ranai compared these disappearances with corresponding silence in peer groups, she noticed a pattern. The people who got closest to acknowledging a species, not just prints or sounds, but population estimates, went quiet permanently. The strangest moment came when she re-examined her own archived emails. Threads she clearly remembered saving were missing entire attachments. In their place, blank file references labeled "removed at sender's request." Except she hadn't received a request. Someone had accessed the thread server side. She confronted a colleague in private, asking how often data went missing. He sighed, glanced around the parking lot, and asked a single question. "Do you really think the government would rather tell the public something new is out here, or pretend nothing is?" It was then Ranai realized the Bigfoot community wasn't just fractured by ridicule. It was being quietly curated by forces that understood silence better than discovery. In 2017, Ranai attended the estate auction of a retired backcountry ranger she had once met during production. He was a quiet man, the sort who remained stationed in high-ridge fire towers during lightning seasons, the kind of ranger who saw more than he ever reported. Among the boxes of maps and faded topo prints, Ranai noticed a small metal tin labeled only with the year 1989. Inside were 4 microcassettes, old field recordings, the type used before digital audio became standard. Late that night, in her garage, she threaded the first tape. The hiss of analog static filled the speakers, followed by distant owls, wind, And then, something else. A howl, but not canine. Its resonance sat lower, subharmonic tones only large air cavities can produce. Then came a second howl, overlapping just slightly, harmonizing. No North American mammal produces coordinated vocal layering like that. Ranai replayed the segment dozens of times, mapping its pitch bend. The pattern almost resembled syllables. Intrigued, she converted the recordings to digital and imported them into university spectrogram software. The color bands, visual fingerprints of sound, displayed a bifurcated structure, two distinct vocal folds acting in unison. Only a handful of primates can do that. Humans can't, wolves can't, bears can't. And at the very bottom of the graph, barely visible, was a third harmonic flicker, like a hidden signature. When she casually presented the file during an academic lunch, two graduate assistants visibly stiffened. They weren't skeptical, they were frightened. One quietly asked where she acquired it. After she answered, both declined to attach their names to any discussion. The conversation ended abruptly when one of them received a text and excused himself, leaving his meal untouched. 48 hours later, Ranai received an email from a department address she didn't recognize. It requested, in the interest of wildlife safety, that she surrender all digital copies of the 1989 recordings. Attached was a document citing a federal wildlife privacy statute she'd never encountered. She ignored it. A week later, the tin vanished from her garage. Nothing else was disturbed. She checked her home cameras. The feed froze between 2:03 a.m. and 2:11 a.m. No glitch, no error code, just silence. The missing tin wasn't the disturbing part. It was the replacement, a single sticky note resting exactly where it had been. It read only, "You have your answer." Ranai still has encrypted duplicates of the audio, but she no longer plays them casually. She plays them the way you might listen to a storm, aware that something outside is awake and listening back. By 2018, Ranai had gathered enough compelling anomalies, audio signatures, stride metrics, territorial patterns, that any curious scientist would have attempted publication. But publishing was exactly what she couldn't do. In academia, Bigfoot wasn't a fringe subject, it was professional suicide. Tenure committees didn't entertain biological ghosts. Grants weren't awarded to researchers who questioned mammalian catalogs. Conservation boards avoided the word cryptid like an invasive fungus. The silence wasn't accidental, it was systemic. She'd watched what happened to those who tried. A respected wildlife biologist from Utah submitted a paper comparing midfoot strike casts to primate locomotion. Within months, his funding dried up. A promising ecologist from Oregon hinted at an unidentified omnivore affecting elk distribution. Suddenly, her university merged her department and eliminated her research focus. These weren't coincidences, they were administrative scalpel cuts. Precise, clean, undisclosed. Sponsors pressured the Finding Bigfoot production team too. Advertisers wanted curiosity, not confirmation. A mystery that never resolves is cheaper to broadcast than a truth that demands action. The show thrived on ambiguity. Ranai's skepticism wasn't just welcomed, it was useful. It kept the narrative safe, playful, profitable. Anytime an episode leaned too close to legitimacy, executives would step in. Thermal figures disappeared, hair sample discussions were trimmed, spectrogram analysis segments were shortened to seconds, then cut entirely. Behind closed doors, even her castmates felt the weight. They joked off camera about being allowed only one step closer to truth at a time, never two. Ranai noticed each time someone spoke too confidently about physical evidence, producers would later take them aside for a tone conversation, not censorship steering. Her fear wasn't ridicule, it was isolation. If she spoke publicly, she risked becoming a mascot for conspiracy circles, used, quoted, distorted, and if she were wrong, she'd permanently stain the careers of anyone who trusted her. So she buried herself deeper into scientific rigor, building walls of data no one would ever see. But something outside academia shifted. After a particularly violent wildfire season, sightings surged, not north, where habitat recovered, but south, collapsing toward human encroachment. Ranchers found livestock kills with pressure fractures, inconsistent with mountain lions. Trail cameras captured blurred, upright silhouettes crossing logging roads in desperate, injured gaits. The population wasn't expanding. It was fleeing. That realization haunted Ranai more than any roar in the dark. Silence was no longer caution. It was negligence. Something was forcing a reclusive species out of its centuries-old territory. A predator? Resource collapse? She didn't know. But she knew this. When a top-tier omnivore begins migrating off-pattern, ecological equilibrium is breaking, and silence, hers included, was becoming part of the problem. For the first time, skepticism felt like cowardice. Everything changed in the spring of 2024. Forestry drones in southern Washington, originally deployed to monitor fire risk, captured something crossing a burn-scarred hillside at 3:14 a.m. The figure was upright, barrel-chested, and covering ground with unnatural efficiency. It moved through deadfall and jagged logs as if stepping over shoeboxes. The operator, a former student of Ranai's, clipped a 5-second segment and sent it through an encrypted link. When Ranai analyzed the footage, frame by frame, micropixel compression revealed muscle contraction at the shoulders and thighs, details impossible for costumes or prosthetics. Its stride revealed mid-tarsal flexibility, a trait seen only in great apes. Even more concerning, its left arm hung lower, slightly swollen. The creature was injured. 2 days later, another drone documented a similar figure sprinting across a drainage cut, leaping a fallen cedar in a clean upward arc. No human could accelerate like that with an injured limb. Ranai compared both clips with her archived vocal recording from 1989, noticing patterns aligning with distress calls in chimp communication. Something was chasing this species, not predation, but displacement. Habitat pressure had reached a threshold. Ranai compiled the evidence into a private report and attempted quiet contact with regional wildlife offices. Every agency replied with the same scripted line: no classified fauna consistent with description. When she forwarded the spectrogram overlays, she received no response at all. That was the moment she understood. The silence wasn't confusion, it was policy. Last month, Ranai broke her silence in a controlled interview. Calmly, she stated the species exists and is retreating south. She emphasized no threat to humans. These animals avoid us. The real danger, she claims, is whatever occupies the territory now vacated. Rangers have begun reporting resonant, ultra-low roars, too deep for primates. Livestock carcasses show crushing force without tearing, suggesting something large hunts by impact, not teeth. Her closing line was chilling. If we only look at what's running, we'll never prepare for what's pursuing it. Her message wasn't hype, it was ecological mathematics. Something big just moved onto the board, and this time, silence won't protect anyone.